Hey guys, thanks for checking out my video. Today I'm going to show you the process I went through to make my first chessboard. There are lots of mistakes in it, and so I hope to be able to share those with you in an effort to help you avoid them if you would like to do something like this yourself. So the woods I'm using are hard maple, that's the whiter stuff, and then the red stuff is called paduk. It's an African hardwood, and it's actually my first time working with exotic hardwood, and it was pretty cool. So the first step in making a chessboard is figuring out the size of squares that you want. I decided on 2-inch squares for my board. Then you need to cut your stock to length. Make sure to leave yourself about an extra inch in case you mess up. I cut my board 17 inches long, which ended up being just enough. I should have cut them a bit longer to be safe, but it worked out in the end. Once they're the right length, you need to cut them to width. This should be the exact width of your desired squares. Now, I wasn't thinking the first time I did this, and I thought it would be cool to have slightly bigger squares, so I ended up cutting them at 2 1/8, which doesn't sound like much more, but that would require an extra inch in length because the final board is 8 by 8 squares. So here I am doing the glue up of the 2 1/8 inch boards, which I'm just going to have to recut because they aren't long enough for that size of squares. Luckily, I realized this before it was too late, otherwise I would have wasted all that material. One really valuable lesson I learned was about gluing. I thought you needed to crank down on the boards as hard as you could to get a good bond, but that ended up creating a bow which caused other kinds of problems. So as far as I understand, it definitely needs to be snug, but don't crank on it with all your strength. And here I am cutting those strips apart again. The blade takes out about 1/8 of an inch, so after doing this I had those 2-inch wide strips I had originally planned for. I had to square up this edge of the board to run it against the fence of the table saw, because it wasn't perfectly flat after the glue up. I used a track saw for this. And just checking that it's perfectly square. Once that edge was square, I trued up the other end of the board, which wasn't really necessary because it just ended up as scrap. Another issue I really should have corrected before any of this was that my paduk was actually a bit thicker than the maple. This made cutting these strips on the table saw difficult because it kept getting caught as I was pushing it through. Ideally, just run all the boards through a planer or a drum sander before gluing them up. Here we see how to achieve the checker pattern. Just rotate every other strip and voila! Alright, so here's the glue up of those strips. They had to be perfectly aligned, otherwise it would ruin the pattern. So I just took my time and made sure that I adjusted the boards as needed as I was tightening the clamps. The squares ended up perfectly aligned, but because of my terrible clamping strategy, it definitely made the board more wonky than it should have been. Also, I think that a better gluing table would help out a lot. Just resting the clamps on the table isn't the best, and I think that also contributed to the problem. If anyone has any actual tips for gluing up boards like this, please write them in the comments below. That would help me out a lot. My poor gluing skills created a lot more work for me. If I had a planer big enough to put this through, it wouldn't be so bad. But all I had was this little drum sander, so I sanded away with that for a couple of hours. No fun. But in the end, I think it turned out pretty okay. Now that the board is all the same thickness, I sanded it with an orbital sander to take out any marks left over from the drum sander. I did take it all the way to 220 grit here, but I should have saved the final sanding for, well, closer to the end of the project, because I just ended up doing it again. I also had to clean up two edges of the board because they weren't perfectly flat. I decided to do it by hand because I didn't want to take off too much material and end up with weird rectangles on either side of the board. You could probably use a belt sander if you're really careful. Next, it was time to create the border, which I wanted to do in two parts. I had this strip of maple left over from cutting the original strips, so I went about cutting some thin strips out of it. Now, when cutting thin strips on a table saw, they tend to get caught between the fence and the blade. They're usually not dangerous, just stand out of the way and be careful. It can be surprising if they fly back at you like that, though. Then I just cleaned up those strips on the drum sander. This was quick and easy. And then it was time to glue them up. I did this in two parts, just gluing up two opposing sides at a time. I wanted to make sure everything got glued flat, so I hammered it down. It's kind of funny to see in this footage that the chessboard actually raises up when I hit it on this end, and then lowers back down when I hit it on the other. In the end, it worked out fine since I had so much extra space. Here I'm just cutting off the extra material before I put it through the drum sander to take down the thickness. You can see in this shot just how much material I had to remove from the board to get it flat. And honestly, the bottom still has issues, but I gave up on it since it was, the bottom. And a final cleanup of the corners. And now it's time for part 2 of the border. This ended up being the hardest part of the entire project for me. It took a lot of figuring out and I had to do things I've never done before. Which actually is basically everything since I'm so new at this, but you don't know that. So I cut what I had left of the Paduk to length and width, but I didn't want a flat border. I wanted an angle. So I had to adjust the table saw to cut the two strips as close as I could get to right in half diagonally. I thought I had it exactly right here, but I was still a bit off. I just had to go back and fix it later. This was probably the scariest cut I've done. You can see here the pieces on the right are just a bit taller. I just had to cut off the bottoms to make it the right height. It was slightly difficult because I didn't have a flat edge against the fence. You can see my push stick keeps slipping and pushing the piece into the blade a bit. In the end, it wasn't too big of a problem, and I got it right. Now, I wanted to make it look like the main chessboard sat above the Paduk border, so I had to make them a bit thinner. So I got my measurement and cut the top down to size. This gave me, I thought, a nicely shaped border. They did have some saw marks though, so I just had to clean those up on the belt sander. Here I'm marking the 45-degree angles for the joints. I just marked the one end on each board so I could go back and mark the other end once I had them fitting well. I've never done 45-degree joints before, as I'm sure you'll see here shortly. We moved the miter saw to the front porch because we're remodeling and it was easier to cut our new floor out there. But this is where I made my first mistake. If you look closely, I flipped two of the pieces around and cut off the other end because I thought that's what I had to do to make them fit the other pieces. I was wrong. I really needed to swing the miter saw around to the other 45 for the other corners. I figured it out eventually. And here's all the pieces cut correctly this time and fitting somewhat okay-ish. There's some pretty bad gaps, but I didn't think I could get them any better by sanding or cutting them farther, and I had a plan on how to fill them. So I decided to glue it up. It was helpful to match each edge with the border that I thought would fit best, so I put numbers on them. This assembly table was quite nice for clamping, as it provided something to clamp against. The clamps on the table held the border down, and I put the long clamps on the table and the board itself. It worked out well, so I just repeated the process a few more times. And here are those ugly, ugly gaps. Unfortunately, one of the border pieces ended up higher than the others. It wasn't something I couldn't fix, but it was annoying. I kept all these scrap pieces from previous cuts, and they ended up working pretty well to help fill those gaps. I just glued them in with super glue. I also kept some dust for finer spaces. It certainly wasn't a perfect solution, but it's the best I had. If anyone has good tips on how to do 45 so they actually fit each other, that would be awesome. And of course, it took a lot of sanding to clean up. I sanded so much I kind of took off the hard corners, but I like the rounded look as well. It looks more like it was done on a shaper, I think. And here's the nearly end result after a lot of sanding. And of course, the final step before applying the finish was more sanding. The finish I chose was this wipe-on poly. It's really easy to apply and leaves a nice satin finish. I wanted to avoid it looking like plastic. And after a couple of coats of that, sanding in between, it was done. Let me know what you guys think. I really enjoyed making this project. Hopefully you learned something. I know I did. And please like and subscribe. Thanks.